Okay, well, let's get rolling then. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another of our ongoing series of webinars with very prominent speaker. And today we are very, very privileged to have with us Sir Michael Cullen. On behalf of CFA Society New Zealand, Sir Michael, I would love to welcome you and thank you profusely. And of course, our moderator, Craig Stobo from Saturn Advice. And with that, I just again would welcome everybody and hope you enjoy. And Craig, I'll pass on over to you.
Thank you, and Tanakwe, Sir Michael. Do I call you Sir Michael or Michael? What's the
Michael?
Yeah, Michael. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your valuable time.
They usually get.
Thank you for your valuable time. I know the time value you have now is priceless since your diagnosis. So I'm truly grateful that you've given me 60 minutes to make some inquiries about your career as Minister. The format's pretty simple. We're imagining ourselves in a comfortable backcountry hut, maybe behind a Hopi somewhere, in front of a fire. You don't know my questions and I don't know your answers, so it'll be a conversation around the fire. But I do want to concentrate on your stewardship as Minister of Finance, 99 to 2008, and your Deputy Prime Ministership from 2002 to 2008, and the fifth Labor government where you were able to manage and produce 9 budgets. So if we just go back to the 99 election, at that time you came in with some very important social policies, increase the minimum wage, you're going to remove the interest on student loans, you're going to rationalise or renationalise, I beg your pardon, ACC, and you're going to increase the top marginal tax rate to 39 cents. And that was an indication, I think, of the start of the fifth Labor government around what reforms were important to you. Do you want to just take us through why there was that sequence first?
Right. Well, I think to understand, in this sense, that suite of policies, you've got to understand the history of the Labour Party in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, obviously, the Longy, Douglas, Palmer, Cagle government putting the 4 main people together in one go, went down a track of basically neoclassical economics, with Longy finally realising where that was leading to. And that caused tremendous internal concern within the Labour Party. And really the 1990s for Labour in opposition were about re-establishing its position as the centre-left alternative in New Zealand, with National re-establishing itself as the centre-right. At one point in the late 80s, that was almost reversed. Indeed, if you listen to Jim Bolger today, you'd think he was the best Labour Prime Minister New Zealand has had. So we went into the 1990 election really with a couple of key long-term goals. The first was to re-establish that the government was going to do what it said it would do before the election, which had become a rather novel idea by 1999. Really, both the Labour and National governments have been characterised by saying one thing during the election campaign and then doing often quite opposite things when in government. So public trust in the system was low, and the expression of that, of course, was the passing of the electoral referendum legislation, which brought in the mixed member proportional system of election. The second thing was to prove you could be a centre-left government but still be responsible fiscally. I saw myself as being in a kind of long line of Labour ministers of finance who were centre-left but were fiscally somewhat conservative. Certainly people like Nordmeyer, but also Walter Nash, even I think Bill Rowling, Bob Tizard, but they were sort of sat upon, particularly Bob, by Norman Kirk in a fashion which made it extremely difficult to be fiscally conservative in changing circumstances. So those are the kind of 2 underlying themes, if you like. But obviously there were things which were crucial. For us, repealing the Employment Contracts Act and replacing it by somewhat more worker-friendly legislation was crucial. The ACC one was really about removing the potential for privatisation, because actually what we inherited was a split of the state provider into 2 state providers, because WorkSafe, or what it was called, I can't remember now, it was called something like that, what was itself owned by the government. But clearly the intention was to move down a partial privatisation track. The tax rate one was rather different kind of signalling. There'd become an assumption that tax rates going to move downwards, which makes it almost difficult to deliver, if you like, a social democratic suite of policies, because if you're continually fighting a reducing government revenue, then it's extremely hard to do things like any form of income redistribution, because effectively, politically, you can only do that out of the surplus of growth. Trying to redistribute out of a static pie, if you like, or a decreasing pie in terms of revenue is almost a political impossibility, since you have to whack so hard into those in the middle to make that possible. Now that of course led to one hell of a fight with the business sector in the first year in government. I mean, it was really most unpleasant. And really what I kept saying to them was, well, look, we were elected on this, and to expect us then to immediately turn around and not do it is to show a certain kind of contempt for the democratic process. I think in the end we sort of won some of the arguments, because actually the Labour legislation wasn't a reversion to compulsory unionism or going back to the 1970s in terms of industrial relations. We delivered actually lower costs for ACC, and we delivered what was obviously fiscally conservative government in terms of surpluses and reducing debt. But it took a long time for that to sink in. And as with the current Labour-led government, business confidence surveys always tended to be negative on the general figure, even when we were in the middle of a growth boom. And I think Labour governments just have to face that. Most people in senior levels of business favour right-wing parties, and therefore they will tend to sort of be somewhat gloomy about the forthcoming year. You just have to kind of work your way through that problem.
I'll just pick up that theme of disenchantment. So when you started in 99, unemployment was about 7%. The OCR had just been brought in and was sitting at 5%, went up to 6.5% by mid-2000. We had the dot-com crash, and for the youth adjacent of us who remember that time, the NASDAQ fell 77% all the way through to mid-2002. Kiwi dollar fell to 39 cents in November 2000, which was a low in that cycle. And GDP fell to 1% by 2001. So they're pretty tough times.
Yes.
And you or someone concocted this phrase of the winter of discontent.
Yes.
For that period of time.
I think that was Shakespeare, but never mind.
and you actually said there was a capital strike.
Yes, I mean, there was business sort of said, basically, we're not going to be investing. In fact, they did, by and large. And the own business survey was always a bit better than the general mood survey, general business conditions survey. And of course, I mean, we weren't alone in the world in 2000 being a low point. And so often in those sort of dot-com crises and the flow on still from the Asian financial crisis, there was a huge movement of money into the US financial markets. The US dollar went up. We went particularly low, but of course that, funnily enough, sparked quite an export-led recovery. So we started off in one of those very strange phases in New Zealand where we had an export-led recovery rather than kind of borrowing and consumption-led recovery. We got that later on in the government, an increasing problem with the growing imbalances in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's a theme that comes through perhaps as an echo chamber today with the current Labour government or coalition around trying to get, how does that party, or why does that party not get business, or why does business not get the Labour Party? So we'll pick that theme up later on. But if we just progress during that year, you came up to your first budget in 2000 and you very clearly, as you've just enunciated, put out a strategy which was signalled before the election, which was to hold core Crown debt at around 20% of GDP. I think the national government was arguing for a lower rate of around 15%. You wanted to hold government expenditure at 35% of GDP, partly because you were concerned about contributing to health and education. And because of the tax changes, you were hoping to generate surpluses from tax. In fact, they went up over 3% of GDP, a rapid rise in taxation, which was used to fund the Cullen Fund, which I've called it the Cullen Fund, and it's now of course, New Zealand superannuation run by the Guardians. But for my benefit, can you just take us through where that idea came from? How did you,
Right.
where was that kernel of inception for that idea?
Right, we went into the 1990 election with a policy which I developed through the 1990s, which was partial pre-funding of New Zealand Super. And alongside that, carving out part of the income tax base as a separate, if you like, New Zealand Super tax. It wasn't an additional tax, it was part of the base, but set at a level which would basically be a tax smoothing exercise through the years of the coming into the New Zealand Super net of the baby boom generation. I mean, I'm the last of the pre-baby boom generation. Apparently it's called the silent generation, which is a bit strange, and Mick Jagger is part of it, but never mind. That idea then was to have a social security tax, which if need be could be slowly moved over time upwards, but generating surpluses which would be invested, and that would become a partial offset against otherwise necessary future tax increases to fund New Zealand Super. The problem we ran into with our coalition partner, the Alliance, which was a significant part of the government at that point, was that they were deeply committed to progressive taxation. And they argued that everything had to be progressive. And I argued, well, if you have a flat tax in New Zealand Super, that'll actually make the rest of the income tax system more progressive, which they couldn't quite see the arithmetic of. But it's, of course, factually true. It wouldn't change the progressivity of the income tax system, particularly with a new top rate of 39 cents to the dollar. So the compromise was that they agreed to the super fund, somewhat reluctantly, and I agreed reluctantly to drop what in effect was a form of social security tax, which of course many developed countries have social security taxes, which is why it's so hard to compare your income tax rates if you include social security taxes. So the deal in the end was that we had a super fund, which was a smoothing exercise, but as Brian Easton, I think, has pointed out on a couple of occasions, was also a very convenient place to park growing surpluses, operating surpluses. They weren't cash surpluses necessarily, but operating surpluses, from the sort of greedy maws of all the big spenders in the cabinet. All thought, oh, well, you know, we're running a surplus of $4 billion, so why can't I get $2.5 billion of that for my projects? So there was always this tension, which the super fund was a very useful form of moderation of. And unfortunately, of course, with no contributions during the last national government, and now saying again if the government no contributions, the super fund is well behind the target it was meant to reach by this point in terms of assisting in future super costs. I mean, it was actually designed to be started drawing down in 2025. Well, clearly that's going to be pushed out well into the future from this point.
So the legislation was 2001 and the fund started in 2003. As you said, this drawdown is expected in 2035 and it peaks in about 2070. But a well-known actuary, New Zealand actuary locally, told me there are no assets without liabilities. And of course, as you said, it's the super fund is a smoothing exercise, pre-funding future New Zealand pension liabilities. But the public and political parties find it very difficult to engage on a discussion around addressing the liabilities, which of course is the pension itself, which is related to 66% of the net average wage and a CPI adjustment every April. But no one wants to adjust the retirement formula or retirement age. So do you understand why people don't want to go there?
Well, again, you go back to history. I was the Minister of Social Welfare that did indeed do that. We introduced legislation in 1989, which would lower the relativity from its then 80% to a wage band of 65% to 72.5%, but not starting until 2005. In other words, starting at the point that the baby boomers would start retiring. So it was deliberately saying up to that point, and we're not moving, but we are moving the relativity, and then we'll also be moving the age from that point on up to age 65. National basically promised that it would increase super by the CPI every year, which was different from what I had promised in 89-90. It broke that promise for 2 years in a row. And then it also, in the 91 budget, of course, brought forward the shift in the age of, in the age of qualification very substantially, brought it right the way forward to 1991. So it started moving immediately. Now that collapsed the National Party vote, which is the reason they very nearly lost the 1993 election, was essentially over those broken promises on New Zealand super. So politicians have been pretty leery about that. And of course, one of the awful psephological truths, which is demographic truth as well, is the more the population ages, the more, even more, the electorate ages, because older people have a high propensity to enrol, and if enrolled, they have a high propensity to vote. So if you've got more elderly people look like me, then they've got a bigger say in the future of the country. And trying to get across to them with a change in age 10 years down the track starting is not going to affect them. It just doesn't ever get through the noise which is created. Now, I did put up to Treasury a few years back, under the previous government, a suggestion that if you made New Zealand a Kiwisaver compulsory, and part of the deal for that was you continued the government subsidies, but there was a kind of 10 or 15%, in effect, capital gains tax paid directly into the super fund as you exited from Kiwisaver on the new arrangements. It was forward-looking, not up to that point. Then the numbers that were done then, they wouldn't work quite so well now, given rates of return, but the numbers done then suggested that by the end of the century, we barely need any taxation to fund New Zealand super, with one step change in the age. I still think there is a lot to be said for thinking about something like that. But again, politically, very, very difficult to feel anything that's changing in this area, because a government can say they'll do it, but oppositions are faced with that juicy, juicy plum in front of them that says, you know, bite me and promise to reverse the change. And that temptation has proved too often too difficult, and you can never get full agreement around this issue, sadly, in a democratic country. And of course, MMP makes it worse, because effectively New Zealand First emerged as the Old People's Party, and its first demand in the coalition negotiations in 1996 of both major parties was that the income and asset test, or the income test on New Zealand super, which was the superannuation surcharge, the higher tax rate on other income, had to be abolished. And it was a very modest income test, but it went. And of course, the fiscal consequences of that are bigger now than they were in 1996.
Okay, you mentioned contributions to the NZ Super Fund. It currently sits at about $45 billion, according to the website. $15 billion of that was government contribution, and under national, that ceased. The contribution ceased in 2009, under 2017, and the website, using Treasury analysis, understands that that represents an opportunity cost, foregone gains of about $10 billion of gain, right, that didn't accrue to future liabilities. So just on this really important point, because you've helped construct this, do you think that the institutional structures we have in place now, both the fund and the guardians, are robust enough to stop politicians raiding that fund?
You can't, yes, I'm aware there are some media people on the line here. Unfortunately, in our constitutional system, there is no way of stopping a government raiding the fund, even if you had an entrenched clause. And don't forget, the National Party opposed the setting up New Zealand Super Fund, so it would have been impossible to entrench it at that point. All the constitutional experts I've ever talked to say that the government can repeal the whole legislation, including the entrenching clause, with a simple majority. So your protection is public opinion. Now, I think what you saw under the Key government was that the Key government would probably have liked to have raided the fund, but knew that politically they couldn't do that. So the next best step from their perspective was not to contribute. And currently, of course, you've got the National Party spokesperson saying they won't contribute for at least 4 years because they want to have temporary tax cuts to boost the economy. The situation indeed in 2009, in retrospect anyway, was such a clear opportunity that the markets were so low at that point with the global financial crisis. The buying into the market in 2009-10 would have been a bargain, and sovereign wealth funds were the people best situated in the world to do precisely that. But we decided in New Zealand not to do it. So that was a real foregone opportunity at that time.
Okay. Just turning to student loans for a moment, and they came, interest-free student loans came in 2000. At the moment, the outstanding's around $16 billion as a 2019 report from the Education Council website. The average balance is about $23,000. There's 154,000 borrowers out there. But I did note in that report that they estimate the cost of every dollar lent by the Crown to students has a cost of around about 41 cents in the dollar. It seems to be a really expensive exercise to be able to get cash to students. Is that the best policy instrument to deliver what you want to do with students in tertiary institutions?
Whether it's the best, it's the one that people are best agreed upon. I mean, just to correct you slightly, Craig, in 2000, we only abolished the interest on students while they were students. The second phase came in the 2005 budget, coming to force in 2006. And interestingly, at that point, what we were looking at was the possibility of funding the tertiary institutions more so that they could reduce fees. But it's always been a difficult process trying to impose fee structures upon the tertiary institutions, and they hate it when you do. So in the end, going via the student loan scheme and making it cheaper for students. It's interesting that outstanding debt, though, is not much more than it was quite some years ago. It hasn't risen at the same rate that it was. It's no longer the same burden, I think, for graduates to pay off. And it's no longer the same political hot potato that it became by the early 2000s. In the same way that we put up the assets exemption for people in rest home care very substantially, and then increased it progressively slightly after that. It's now around about $230,000, but it's not a big issue. Whereas in the 1990s, 2000s, there was a huge pressure to completely abolish any asset test on rest homes, which I resisted as Minister of Finance, I have to make clear. And this was a compromise. I think it's a compromise that's worked. We've found a level at which people think it's reasonable that they can keep part of the assets that they previously had via their home. And we don't have the same pressure to completely abolish it, which would be very expensive in terms of increased government spending for rest home care. And of course, an item of expenditure which would increase enormously in cost over the next 30 or 40 years, given the ageing of the population, both through demographic factors and through, of course, increased life expectancy, and therefore more and more people with things like dementia and so on, which requires them to have that kind of high-level care.
Okay, so we move forward a little bit further to 2004, 2005, when you instructed officials to renovate, improve the taxation of managed funds, which led to the PI regime, which basically underpins Kiwisaver. So in 2007, Kiwisaver started, October, I think it was. Can you just tell me again the genesis for Kiwisaver? What was your thinking behind that? Where did that come from?
Well, that came largely from me, but with a change of mind. I mean, I started off with a very clear view in the 1990s that the role of government was confined to providing the basic superannuation, sufficient to live on, but not a sort of highly comfortable level of provision, and that then people should provide for themselves on top of that. what began to change my mind gradually over time were a number of different things. One was the sort of slow decline in employment-based superannuation anyway, which was going on as employers, under the Employment Contracts Act kind of framework, no longer saw themselves as having any particular role in that kind of social provision. Same way in the States, you're seeing over recent times employers withdrawing from things like health provision to a substantial extent. Secondly, I think that this argument that went on in the left was, we're always worried about foreign control of our economy. And I kept saying, well, we have a terrible savings deficit in New Zealand. That's called our current account deficit. And there's no point complaining about borrowing from offshore if you're not prepared to do something over the longer term about our current account deficit. So we have to increase our savings in some way or another and try to change the savings culture in New Zealand, which was pretty poor and part of that whole kind of short-term view of an economy. And then the third element, of course, was the changes which I hadn't supported, but obviously voted for, around the taxation regime on superannuation schemes to TTE, supposedly aligning it with other forms of investment. In fact, it was never fully aligned, of course. There were always differences across various forms of savings. And I fought a long battle with officials around trying to get discussion around how, why, and could we change TTA, and finally TTE, and finally accepted I wasn't going to win this. So it came down to thinking, well, what can we do about workplace savings? Chairman Mallard and I brought in a new state sector scheme, the state sector retirement scheme, which was quite successful. Had about 30,000 members within a couple of years of being set up. But then I sort of sat down and thought, well, what about, and we have various consultations going on, of course, as you know, around the place. What about some form of auto-enrolment scheme, not going as far as the Australians, but in essence using inertia as a means of getting people to save. And essentially Kiwisaver Mark 1, because remember there was a Mark 2, which came in. Kiwisaver Mark 1, as per the 2005 budget, was basically $1,000 up front, a bit of twiddling around some of the fees supporting some of that, and then a 4% or 8% choice by the saver, and progressively a little bit of sweetener for employers to try to contribute by not subjecting them to the taxation normally applied to employer contributions. Even that proved more successful than envisaged, but when the fiscal outturn was better than anticipated, then I decided we could move to Kiwisaver Mark 2, which was both mandating some employer contribution, but also the government itself contributing in a way which was designed to make Kiwisaver a progressive scheme. In other words, a scheme whereby with the government contribution, those on lower incomes were able to save proportionately more than those on higher incomes. And those on very high incomes, I never saw as part of the market for Kiwisaver. I mean, I never saw that as a market we needed to worry about for employment-based retirement income. The one thing looking back that I regret is if I was to do it again, I'd make the $1,000 sweetener applied at age 18 rather than being able to be used at age 0. I think that was a bit of a design error, which caused a certain degree of absolutely predictable, in retrospect, misbehaviour by those who are better off and could sort of start their kids off with a little lump sum from the government.
Straight away, yes.
Straight away.
The other...
quite expensive as a consequence.
In the taxation design that is incorporated in Kiwisaver, of course, is the concept of a fair dividend rate. So
yeah.
A 5% tax or assumed yield
tax
on
on
overseas investments.
Yeah,
at 5%. Yeah, so I put up the concept that should be rolled out into Australia, New Zealand assets as well, but you turned that down and kept it capital gains free and just tax on the dividends of companies. Yeah. Any regrets around that, given the tax working group?
Oh, yes,
that's
probably.
Published this year?
In retrospect, we had enough of a hell of a fight on our hands with the proposal we did put up. You might recall that Tony Gibbs and GPG and ABN AMRO Craigs went completely berserk about the proposal, somehow completely missing the fact that it only applied above a certain level of income, and that most people who are within that net actually weren't within the net in terms of the taxation proposal, that they were exempt from it. I mean, capital gains, you know, at that point was still a political complete no-no. I mean, it's one of those issues that's really weird. Whenever you poll the public when we haven't got a discussion going on about the nature of it, a majority are in favour of a capital gains tax. As soon as you start suggesting one, the supporters sort of seem to somehow disappear at various nooks and crannies, and the support becomes weaker and the opposition becomes stronger. The position I now hold, and I've expressed this to my friends in a certain building in Wellington, is I think going the whole hog, as the tax working group majority suggested, is probably just too difficult. And I have big reservations about the active business approach in terms of capital gains. I think it gets very difficult, particularly given the changing nature of businesses over the last 10 or 20 years. I mean, when you're dealing with, you know, setting up new companies in the technology area where you don't make any profit for ages, but the company gets worth more and more money, and somebody's hoping somebody's going to actually pay out a dividend eventually. Some of them actually haven't. You know, who was a grand example of this. It all comes difficult, particularly if you've made it a sort of symmetrical capital gains tax, so losses are able to be offset, and then you've got, oh, this is rather expensive, isn't it? As a form of revenue gathering. But where I've landed up is I do think that there is an enormous powerful argument in the New Zealand context for capital gains tax on what you might generally speak as the land asset, because so much of the growth in value in land assets has got nothing to do with people, you know, the famous Kiwi mums and dads putting the effort in. I mean, it occurs for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are not very good. And if you take farming, for example, which gets the biggest sort of opposition for obvious reasons, because New Zealand farmers farmed for decades on the basis of the capital gains they were going to get at the end, because the actual rate of return on their equity was pretty appalling for a long time. But that's partly because of the lack of capital gains and the way in which the equity increased because of the growth in the land value. But you know, a good farmer who really looks after the land doesn't get much more of a capital gain than a bad farmer, because the price of the land is potential value for the future, rather than what its particular current state may be. So there's a huge amount of, you know, what in good old-fashioned left-wing language used to be called the unearned increment in land. And the same is true of being very careful here, non-owner occupied housing in Auckland, because owner occupied housing is a kind of sacred cow that is well armed and shoots back at you if you try to shoot it. But non-owner occupied housing, there's a huge gain that's been going on there, and that's attracted distorted investment patterns in New Zealand, I think pretty obviously to the detriment of New Zealand Inc. and New Zealand's economic performance. I mean, if we've been pouring too much investment into one class of asset, which is not necessarily of itself particularly productive in many cases, then it's hard not to believe that has reduced our overall well-being and potential growth in national income.
Yeah, we'll come back to that conundrum in a moment, but I want to turn to your role as Minister of Health and Deputy Prime Minister, where you subsequently held the position of Chair of the Bay of Plenty DHB. So you're one of the few people that I could talk to who was both Minister of Health and has been a chair of a DHB. So
I was only Associate Minister of Health a couple of years to the late 80s. Helen wouldn't allow me to do all of health. And actually, oh no, that was education. There were two portfolios I spent quite a bit of my time running away from it in various governments, health and education.
Yep, you did. So in 1999, the health budget was $6.6 billion, and now it's $20 billion. And you were on record in 2005 as saying, We can't keep spending on health at 7% growth per annum. It's just unsustainable.
Yep.
And I went through the reforms from 1993 to Heather Simpson's report this year. In 93, there were 14 area health boards, which became RHAs. Then Crown Health Enterprises came in.
Yep.
Then the Health Funding Authority came in.
Yep.
Then we got 24 not-for-profit Crown-owned enterprises.
Yep.
Then we got PHOs, and now we're going to have a super authority over the top of the Ministry of Health. You have to argue that this is just a mess. What are your insights on how do we go forward on health?
Well, I think we have an obsession with local control in New Zealand in the health system, which actually doesn't contribute to our health system. So quite rightly, every party in opposition points out that we have a kind of postcode lottery for some of the services that we provide because there's a lack of proper central direction. I was only chair of the District Health Board for 3 months before stepping down.
Yes.
But in that time, I became very conscious that the Ministry of Health has a tremendous lack of delivery capacity. It's a policy shop and it's a monitoring shop. But being a ministry is not a delivery shop, and it has a weak public health function and a weak capacity to direct the system in terms of priorities. So every district health board in the country knows that too much money is going into hospital care compared with community and public health. Every district health board knows that the result of the latter is that Maori health statistics are very poor compared with Pākehā, and there's underinvestment in primary healthcare in that area. And we keep trying to find structural solutions. I certainly think we've got too many DHBs. I mean, they were set up, and you know what's going to happen once the government says that we're going to reduce the number and go back to the old idea of having maybe 6 area health boards. They'll say that these local hospitals are going to be closed as a result of this. There's no direct connection between those two things at all. And many district health boards have actually got too small a population to make sense in terms of health administration. And some are well below the level at which you should, that makes sense. Whether you want a health funding authority, as the Heather Simpson report suggests, I'm not convinced about that. I mean, I would much rather see a strengthened Department of Health, which is capable of delivering, if you like. So I was just looking slightly strange. I see my dog outside, who appears to be not actually connected to any lead. But never mind, I'll sort of have to leave that for the moment. So I think you need a strong Department of Health. I do believe that there is a very powerful argument for some kind of Maori Health Authority, although John Tamaheri is playing a rather heroic game of poker and suggesting a quarter of all funding goes into it, because the Maori Health Authority would be dealing with public and community health, not with the hospital sector and so on. But some way in which we can ensure that we really do start to deal to the issues of lack of Maori access into the remainder of the health system, including at the front end, into the primary and public healthcare system. The big issue is, are we yet out of line with international norms? And probably we're still not. I mean, there's that famous correlation between per capita, real income per capita as percent of GDP, and spending on health percent of GDP. I mean, it's a sort of, except for the big outlier of the United States, which is somewhere up here because it's so much privatized, practically everybody lies along that little strip pretty closely. And we are almost dead on the line still. Yep. So we're not out of control, but you really have to wonder when you see stories like today, managed care, what we used to call elective surgery lists, growing substantially, despite a very large input of more money into the health system under the current government, under the previous government not so much, but still by far the largest single increase in spending of any government agency every year. Yep. Was health. Yep. So there is a sort of issue there of, if you like, in the old-fashioned language, value for money. Are we actually getting out of this what we think we're putting in. And you get all these unsustainable demands, which are very, very hard to deal with in healthcare, because we measure ourselves against countries with higher per capita income. Now, naturally enough, they're going to have higher per capita spending on health, some of which is just circular. I mean, if you've got higher per capita income, you've got to pay your doctors more, your nurses more, and so on. It just gets swallowed up in the roundabout of wages and salaries. But you do actually have the capacity to do somewhat more at the margins in terms of things like drugs and so on and so forth.
Yep. Okay. Not particularly your baby, Kiwibank, but as you had a position of New Zealand Post Board, which is a shareholder now, together with two other agencies in Kiwibank. And just looking at the Reserve Bank website, which has a snapshot of all our banks, $26 billion in assets, net profit of 57 mil for the June year. Pretty high cost to income ratio, which suggests it hasn't really got scale yet. And return on assets, which of all the reported entities on that website is the only minus. Is it the best use of taxpayer money to allocate capital to Kiwibank? And
there's taxpayer money vested in Kiwibank, but there's very little money goes on an annual basis. It's really over to the three shareholders, one of which has no money to invest. That's New Zealand Post. And the other two, of course, are on the whole reasonably well off, but sort of up against it in the current international investment situation. I think Kiwibank has partly paid for itself by becoming a competitor to the four Aussie banks. So there are two ways in which that's happened. The first is that it's certainly put downward pressure on fees. The Aussie banks don't need to collude here. They can collude somewhere else around fees, but they've got a major competitor in the market. The second thing is that during the onset of the global financial crisis, of course, there was a year or two there where Kiwibank was the largest provider of new mortgage money into the New Zealand market, because the Australian banks were clearly under instructions for capital to get sucked back into their parents in Australia. So it worked well there. Kiwibank is still somewhat limited in its capacity to become a significant business bank. It's still primarily a retail bank for the domestic market, which significantly affects its capacity to deliver profits at a similar level to the big four Australian banks. And that's partly a sorry story around growth beyond the capacity of the original back office system to cope with. And then, unfortunately, a major upgrade that went wrong, despite having governance all over the place. I mean, the board had an independent advisor when I was at the Kiwibank board. The management had a different independent advisor, and still somehow or other, and we had a major international supplier doing the work. But even so, it didn't work out. And I'm not going to go into
that,
but you know, it was a major setback for the bank at that point.
No, I've got lots of respect for the board of directors and the CEO, Steve Jerkovich. So just on banking, can I just turn a little bit further under your stewardship to the GFC in 2008? So subprime mortgage collapse, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, absorbed by the federal government, Lehman Brothers bankrupt, and the RBNZ in October cut the OCR 50 basis points from 7.5% from 8 to 7.5%. So at that time, you rolled out pretty quickly the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme. Do you want to take us through the pressure that you were under then and how you reacted to global events to effectively, I think, and my words, not yours, but protect depositors? What was going on?
Well, first of all, I think the GFC really began in 2007, and the effects began to show through by the start of 2008 in both New Zealand and offshore. People didn't really recognise it until things started to move much more in that American financial market with the sort of big collapses, Lehman Brothers and the others. But we certainly felt the cold. And looking at it in retrospect, and I was just looking at these numbers the other day, I think the Reserve Bank was far too slow in reducing the OCR, because inflation was well under control. It already got back down to 2%, but they continued to put up the OCR, and the economy being throttled. I mean, the unemployment was rising quite rapidly through 2008. It in fact almost doubled from its low point in 2006. So I think the RBNZ was very slow to react and could have been pump priming, if you like, the economy somewhat earlier. The guarantee scheme is an extraordinary story. That is not something which we had carefully planned in the form it occurred. We had carefully been planning a partial guarantee scheme and been working on it for some weeks before the announcement. We were well advanced down the track of how to make it work. But Helen and I, sitting in the green room waiting for Helen to launch our election campaign about 4 or 5 weeks out from the election, suddenly got news from our people at the IMF World Bank meeting in Washington, that there were rumours coming out of Canberra that Kevin Rudd was about to announce a comprehensive, and I mean comprehensive, deposit guarantee scheme covering everything. We had allowed a number of finance companies to collapse without looking anywhere near a guarantee scheme, because we thought the basic model was unsound, so we weren't going to prop them up. We got our people in Canberra to check what the story was, and initially the Treasurer's Office didn't seem to know anything about it, and I think they checked. And the story seemed to be that Kevin Rudd had unilaterally decided, which was his way of doing things, that there was going to be an announcement that day of a comprehensive bank deposit scheme, retail financial sector deposit scheme. And I said to Helen, well, we're not going to need choice. We're going to have to announce one as well. Because if we haven't got one and they've got one, we know there's going to be this strange sort of sucking sound out of the New Zealand financial sector very, very rapidly. So I got on the telephone to Bill English and said, look, we've got a problem here. I think this is the only solution. Can you have a quick think and get back to us? Because, you know, we're rewriting the speech right now. Helen's going on the stage in about half an hour. It's about half an hour, something like that. And she's going to have to change the speech, which was mentioning that we were doing a sort of partial guarantee. Bill okayed it, much to his credit, because he could have played, silly buggers at that point. And we announced it. What we then found out was that we were in a position to implement a scheme very rapidly. The Australians weren't. They then took about a week or two to work out how to do it, because they had actually done no preparation work at all for a comprehensive financial guarantee scheme, which I regard, I refer to him ever afterwards as Kevin Bloody Rudd, because I thought it was an extraordinary performance of his to act in that way without the knowledge and without the approval of his own treasurer. He was off in Washington.
Yes. Yeah, okay, great. On the sort of home stretch here, clearly 2008 change of government, etc., and you decided to end your career in Parliament, etc. I just wanted to sort of come forward to today and get your general thoughts on what I'm calling the civic society or democracy as you share it. For example, the centralisation of trustee functions in schools to a regional Ministry of Education hub, the DHBs we've mentioned around moving away from local elected members, the centralisation of polytechs, potentially Three Waters reform, taking Three Waters, the potable water, sewage, wastewater, stormwater out of the control of local authorities. Do you have a view on the fitness of our institutions in Wellington to manage these challenges?
Well,
so what are your concerns about our democracy?
I'd like to express unlimited confidence, but history says one should be careful before making those assertions about centralised institutions. But each of those, I think, is justifiable. I mean, the polytechs, in a sense, is the end point of reforms that I tried to bring in as Tertiary Education Minister in 2006, 2007. Because I think the 89-90 education reforms put the polytechs onto a very, very bad path of trying to compete with universities across the board, and mimicking universities in terms of, you know, full degree structures right up to doctorates and goodness knows what else, and forgetting that their fundamental task was around the sort of trades and technical areas, which we've continued to underproduce people. You know, we are continually crying out, you know, we all very well to have the shovel-ready projects, but do we have enough people who know which end of a shovel's which? If we've got projects which are shovel-ready, which is a pretty good question to ask in New Zealand. So I'm not worried about most of those in their nature. And as I said in the health one, I would tend to prefer a strong Department of Health, but still having regional health authorities of a sufficient size, basically probably one for the South Island, and 3 or 4 for the North Island, which can have integrated levels of delivery of services across the board. Where I think we need to do a lot more thinking is around the nature of the relationship between central bureaucracies and government in general, and the people and civic society in general on the other side. And I think we are still missing the opportunity to form effective partnerships. There are some areas where we've done quite well. I mean, if I take one of the hardest areas, climate change and the primary sector industries, fundamentally Fonterra and most of the other dairy companies and Dairy New Zealand are on board, if you like, with a sort of basic program. But Fed Farmers, which is actually a declining organisation in its power, is just deep buried in a hole in the ground on this. It's into a state of complete denial, and just refuses to cooperate with central government around what ought to be a program of change, which is in the primary sector industry's own best interests. I mean, if we in 20 years' time are producing, if you like, dirty primary products, you can guarantee consumers like the EU will find a hell of a good reason to erect non-tariff trade barriers against us. We have got to be world leaders on the other side of the equation. We've got to be world leaders in being sustainable agriculture. And that requires government and the industries working together, and government actually funding. There may be forms of revenue raising, taxation, whatever, but a lot of that needs to be ploughed back into, literally and metaphorically, into the primary sector industries to accelerate the rate of change which occurs. And that kind of changed approach around partnership is one which, particularly from my background the last 10 years, I would see as crucial to achieving the full potential of many iwi and many Maori trusts to deliver gains for their people, their membership. And we seem to struggle on both sides to find a way in which those partnerships can occur, which is a genuine treaty-based partnership. But it ought to be possible. It ought to be possible for us to actually move beyond a stage where, you know, article I'm doing for the Herald on Saturday morning, just to foreshadow it in business pages, you know, I'm describing many of our peak organisations at the moment as behaving in a very strange way, where they're kind of queuing up to get a morning report to give bad imitations of Oliver Twist. You know, they just keep handing out the cap for asking for more government money, instead of coming to the government and saying, let's sit down and work out a realistic plan for how we have a survivable industry moving into the future. It's no use to tourism industry asking government to subsidise it completely to the point where we just keep everything going, because it's going to be years before that industry is in the state it was before COVID-19 hit us. Not just because of us, what we've done, but because of what's happening in other countries around the world. And there's a sort of lack of capacity to just, okay, let's seriously sit down and where do we go? The primary sectors is actually the easy part, ought to be the easy part, because they're nothing like so seriously affected. Most of them are doing really quite well at the present time compared with others. But tourism, and the other one, of course, obviously, is the international education sector. We sank all our eggs into too few baskets. And one of those baskets is subject to political control anyway, and so could be just snatched away at a moment's notice. Nothing to do with anything like a pandemic or whatever may be the case. So I think we need some really decent thought about how government and how civic societies and industries and community groups can better work together, which means government ceding a level of control, if you like, but ceding it on the basis that it has confidence in the capacity of those other players to deliver in conformity with the government overall plan. And Three Waters one, in some ways, is a case in point. I mean, local authorities can opt out of the Three Waters plan, but then they've got to do it by themselves. What they're opting into effectively is a government partnership in the Three Waters plan, which addresses basic issues that we have to address in New Zealand.
Okay. Got a lot of people knocking on the door of the hut, Michael, with lots and lots of questions. I'm swamped by how many questions there are, but I want to pick up one which was in relation to house prices.
Yes.
And the fact that banks require collateral for loans. So the house is an important asset in everyone's discussions with the bank, but don't you think that effectively inequality has got worse by default under current settings with very low interest rates, where government bonds are purchased in the secondary market by the Reserve Bank under the large-scale asset program? You could argue inequality's got worse, and it exacerbates a whole lot of people who don't have financial or real assets, and they face potentially rising unemployment. This is not a great start for a discussion with civic society, is it?
No, it's not. And obviously, these are all unintended consequences, even if they were foreseeable consequences. And the view I take is a little bit different. I mean, I'm completely opposed to the OCR going negative. I think the signal that sends out about the future of the economy is disastrously self-defeating. I think people will just see that as saying, oops, we're an even bigger poo than we thought we were. And that'll make people less willing to spend, are less willing to invest in the future. What I would really like to see is something rather different from what's going on at the moment, which is basically, yes, the bank buying government bonds, but a clear understanding that the bond program is around investment in future infrastructure, including housing infrastructure. I mean, we do need to build a lot more houses. That's quite clear. You know, it's one of the reasons prices keep going up is we haven't got enough houses compared with the demand, which is out there. So a program which is about building more houses, and let's not get into Kiwi Build, because I've tried to warn Phil Twyford that we had to deal with issues like the labour market and various other things. You can just announce a program and suddenly the houses would magically appear. But if you've got a clear program around infrastructure, around building houses, around other forms, and doing what's being done with Dunedin Public Hospital, where signalling in advance, training the people in Dunedin ready for the rebuild of Dunedin Public Hospital, which is a multi-billion dollar project, then we can achieve some real gains, it seems to me. The Reserve Bank ought to be happy at the thought that we're taking pressure off the housing market if we can build a lot more houses over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, what's not to celebrate if you're sitting in the Reserve Bank, other than maybe this is about the only thing which is propping up inflation at all in the current economy. I mean, the other day I was thinking to myself, well, rather than the temporary income tax cut, which is sort of structured in such a way, you're going to have an awful lot of effectively dead weight cost in it, because most of the money is going to people who are better off, so they won't necessarily spend it all. Why not cut GST in the short term? And then I thought, hell's teeth. The one thing we don't want to do is push the CPI down below zero and start sort of embedding negative inflation. I mean, we know from the Japanese just how hard it is to get out of that once you start going
That's right.
Down that particular road. So I think, you know, the independence of the Reserve Bank is really important, but I think what's happened here and overseas, because these very low interest rates aren't just coming out of COVID-19. I mean, they've been embedded in our economies now for some time. Everybody's struggling with this, and we're into a new normal around all of that. We do need some kind of mechanism of discussion without people going, oh, we're going to lose independence, whereby, you know, those in charge of fiscal policy and other policies related to that, and those in charge of monetary policy, can at least have a grown-up discussion and some level of agreement about where we're trying to go. I don't see that as entrenching upon independence. If the government can tell the Reserve Bank what to do, that's entrenching upon independence. Let's sit down together and say, okay, what are we both trying to achieve here? And I think there's a high degree of commonality between whoever's the government after the election and the Reserve Bank in that regard. What are the roles of each of us, and how can each help the other in achieving those? We might have a much better path of the future, which doesn't have all these unintended consequences you mentioned, which are absolutely right. I mean, there's no question that those who can afford to borrow are sitting in a very, very pleasant position at the present time. And those who can't are just cut out of all that potential wealth growth.
Well, that's a good position to sort of summarise the conundrum of the silos in Wellington and how that can change to better cooperation. I am going to apologise to all the people outside our hut who are clamouring to question us, but we're running out of time. In fact, we have run out of time. So I just want to summarise some things that we've spoken about in our very valuable hour with you, Michael. And the first is to celebrate the size and outcome of what you started in 2001, 2003, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and the Guardians, the Act. As I said, that fund in the June stands out very close to $45 billion investments, $15 billion of government contributions, return, as I will remind myself, because Matt, the CEO, will keep reminding me, pre-tax after cost return per annum since 2003 of 9.63%. And $26 billion excess return over Treasury bills, and expected to grow to $580 billion in 2060 is a fantastic institution that you've built. And as you said, hopefully with our relatively weak constitutional structure, no one will touch that or raid it. Kiwisaver in 2007, 2.9 million Kiwis, $57 billion investment, and a $19,000 average balance, again, institutionally relatively strong, but again, let's hope constitutionally we can keep that going as a voluntary nudge policy with an opt-out function. But I think overall, and in reflection of what is happening with our debt profile going forward, I think we should be grateful for what you achieved in terms of our net core crown debt to GDP. When you started, it sat at 22.6%. And when you finished your career as Minister of Finance in 2008, it was down to 5.4%. And that was because of the financial assets that got built through the New Zealand Super Fund, but also ACC. So what people don't tend to focus on, but it's absolutely true, is that the net worth attributable to the Crown by what was achieved by building financial assets was, as a percentage of GDP, those assets going from 0 in 2000 to almost 56% in 2008. And what you did was set us up for the earthquakes that happened in Christchurch in 2010, 2011. So your conservative fiscal management, yes, there were some policy arguments along the way, meant that we could help people in Christchurch. And I think that's a tribute to your foresight and your management of that portfolio. So on behalf of people on this call, I want to thank you for what you've done for us, and may those careful kaitiaki guardianship of that portfolio continue with future finance ministers. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much, and thank you for your 60 minutes.
Thank you, Craig. It's been a pleasure, and sorry we didn't have time for more questions from those of you on the line. Thank you.
Thank you.